Hello. Hello, my name is Talip Küçükcan. I welcome you on behalf of TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Today we have got a great line of speakers and panelists. Today's session is on humanitarian work in an age of constant crisis. Today is the World Humanitarian Day, but we are not very optimistic when we look at the world around. COVID-19 plus many other crises are just there. So we are going to discuss different aspects of this issue and get questions from you. Let me introduce you our speakers. We have got Dr. Kerem Kınık, who is the president of the Turkish Red Crescent, who has a lot of experience in humanitarian issues. We have got Mukesh Kapila, who is a professor at the Manchester University now, who is in Geneva at the moment, and he has a lot of, I think, experience and great work in the field. We have got Ghada Saba. She is Jordan's first female cinema director and also a gender equality champion by UN Women. And also we have Josephine Schmidt, who is executive editor of the New Humanitarian. I just would like to begin with a general question to Dr. Kerem Kınık. You are not only leading Turkish Red Crescent, but also you are the vice president of the IFRC. When you look at the world around, what kind of challenges we face in terms of humanitarian crisis? Yes, we are maybe focusing mainly on COVID-19 these days, but I think there is much more beyond that.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone from Istanbul, Turkey. We are remembering the scale of humanitarian needs by the COVID-19 pandemics. It's a kind of biological disaster and affected all around the world. And now we are trying to overcome as a mankind, as a unique mankind to these pandemics. But in the meantime, many other challenges we have as a humanitarian actors, mainly natural disasters, over 30 different kind of natural disasters we are facing, from seismic disasters, earthquakes, to hurricanes, or drought and famine crisis, and climate change crisis, meteorological-based natural crisis, and in the meantime, man-made disasters like armed conflicts. There are 40 active armed conflicts in the world now, and the forcibly displacement, the number of forcibly displaced people reached by the 2019 71 million, and over 130 million were in need previous year, but now by the COVID-19, the scale is rising up. Boom! Actually, over 200 million people in need nowadays, and we have to reach them. But if we look at the resources to elevate this suffering is getting smaller. If we look the interest of the government, they are, becoming introverted. They are showing their solidarity. So we as humanitarian actors challenging huge scale of humanitarian crisis and the burden, but with very limited resources.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Actually, we will come to the question of international cooperation, as you have just raised. I think there are some obstacles, but there are some opportunities. I would like to move on to Professor Kapila. Kapila, you are a professor who has done a lot of work and publications on this issue. Would you like to add some more issues to the crises that are identified by Mr. Kınık, like climate change, its impact? The second aspect of the question that I would like to raise with you: how optimistic are you in terms of finding solutions to the crisis that we are facing today?
I think my first reaction, having listened to Dr. Kınık, is how does one measure human suffering? I mean, I think one of the commonest questions one is asked is, which is the world's biggest humanitarian crisis? Now, that begs the question of how do you measure people's suffering? And how do you say that the suffering of a Syrian is worth more or less than the suffering of an Afghan? Or if you are affected by population displacement in South Sudan that is better or worse than being hungry in Venezuela. So I think one of the ways in which the humanitarian crisis scene has moved on in the last decade is we've realized that the metrics of misery convey a very little and limited understanding of the nature of humanitarian crises nowadays. Today, yes, there are high-profile situations like Syria, which is always there. Yemen, of course, is very much in the news. And of course, you know all about South Sudan, Venezuela, and so on. However, today, in our 7.5 billion world, most crises are personal, they are local, and they are all around us in our own societies. It's one thing to to be in crisis in a highly publicized location like Syria, and even that is forgotten. It is a completely different story when actually in neighborhoods around the world, in slums, in deprived communities everywhere, there are people suffering in misery. So my, I think, a throwback question would be: let us stop talking entirely just about how many people are displaced. We know that at least a billion people are in crisis of some sort or the other on very conservative figures. So I think the total narrative around humanitarian crisis has to be revisited. Living in crisis now is a way of life in every country in the world and for huge communities of people everywhere in the world. And your second point, am I optimistic or pessimistic? Well, I think I'm hugely optimistic. Why? Because what strikes me is, and why I'm not downcast by the statistics on human misery, it's simply that I find it remarkable that people survive. I find it remarkable that despite not receiving help, even though we have a huge humanitarian industry in the world at a global level and even at a national level, and never before has so much money been spent on humanitarian action, even though there are big gaps, which I'm sure we will discuss. Most people actually look after themselves and care for themselves and look after the neighbors and care for the neighbors. And you know, you have to be really smart and the famous buzzword, resilient, in order to be able to survive this crisis. So every day I'm amazed to hear of stories of people's survival. And I think if human beings can survive amidst all the things we hear about, wars, climate change, disease outbreaks, and much, much, much worse, then I think we have no right to be pessimistic about the world as it is today.
Well, thank you very much for this optimistic note. Now, let me move on to Ghada Saba, who is a film director and also filmmaker, actually. We all know that cinema plays an important role in the lives of many people, especially to empower disadvantaged sections of society. You know, how important is your work, Ghada Saba, when it comes to raising consciousness about humanitarian issues, especially with regard to gender equality? And yeah, you know, you are living in the Middle East. Jordan is an important country. Turkey is in the Middle East, partly. And we know that our region is also surrounded by a lot of crises. And, you know, how does your work make a difference in terms of raising awareness of humanitarian issues?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's very important. Everyone's work is very important. We cannot say this is more important and this is less important. And I think this is an important point to highlight at this moment, because, for example, now what we watch is TV. All what we watch is series. We're getting ourselves into the, you know, all this kind of online content and online conferences and web and all of that. So it's very important to highlight what's happening really when it comes to gender, when it comes to women, girls, kids, everyone that's suffering more during this crisis for many reasons, as we know and we understand, all of us. One of them is because now we know that a very high percentage of the refugees are kids and women, at least in Jordan. But I know this is the case mostly all over the world when it comes to refugees and people when they have crisis in their homes. We're talking about women suffering in the first place. Plus that we know that during this crisis there was plenty of in Jordan the violence, the domestic violence was raised almost 30% more during the crisis between all the people and between children with special needs and women. So we're talking about violence, domestic violence in general. So when I write messages, when I document what's happening around me, when I try to change the ugly norms that it's about time to be changed regarding law, regarding behavior, regarding way of thinking, I think it's very important these days and all the time to have an open eye for all the problems that's facing gender, that facing women and girls, especially in the crisis, using this, using COVID, using war, using any kind of crisis to make it more suffering for these people and to make it more hard to live and to make it more hard even to access for health, for education. So it's my role as a filmmaker, it's my role as a media person to highlight these people and to give them to make their voices be reached and heard.
Well, thank you very much. I think also this is a very optimistic, message. Now I come to Josephine Schmidt, who has a lot of experience in journalism. She spent most of her life in different, continents: Europe, Asia, United States of America. And she has launched many websites and I think different media outlets. Now, I would like to ask you, what is the state of humanitarian journalism? Professor Kapila said there are lots of good news in terms of responding, but when we look at the media, we usually see quite a pessimistic picture around the world. How would you respond to this kind of question?
Well, all of what he has said is very, very familiar, of course. The state of humanitarian journalism is that we're very, very busy, much like humanitarian workers. And the phrase, the metrics of misery, hits home because I feel that we as the media are often the culprits in pushing that narrative and in using that to get any message across. I worked for a long time for a large mainstream media outlet, and the not always offhanded remark was, if it bleeds, it leads. If it's about misery, if it's about horror, yes, we want that because people will read about it. But the second question was always, if there was a catastrophe, a humanitarian situation, was how many people had died and where are they? And that's where the calculus, the measurement came in, of trying to somehow be the arbiter of what's worth, what do readers, viewers need to hear about, etc. I think with the best of humanitarian journalism, which I believe we at the New Humanitarian practice, we're celebrating our 25th year this year of reporting from the heart of humanitarian crises. We're based in Geneva. We have editors around the world, and we report regularly on the ground from all of the conflicts you've heard of, Yemen, Syria. We report from the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh to many, many others that very few people have heard of. And I think the best of humanitarian journalism is journalism that is becoming much more human, looking at the human and humanitarian, much as we've talked about already here, that really these are human stories. They are personal stories. There are the huge numbers, the 160 million displaced, the numbers of people who face food insecurity, the numbers of people who face losing their lives, their livelihoods because of climate change. But really behind those numbers are individual stories. And those are the stories that we as journalists need to get across, because those are the stories that will make audiences care, that will make them understand that not only should they care about this, but that they want to, and that after all, they're reading about, listening to people who are just like them.
Josephine, can I ask you one more thing? Yes, you have a lot of coverage, maybe lots of reporting, but do you think there is an impact of such, journalism? How does that change the lives of people on the ground? Can you measure that impact?
It's very difficult to measure that impact. We as a nonprofit media organization measure our impact in a number of different ways. One of our mandates, part of our mission, is to amplify the voices of people on the ground, of people at the heart of humanitarian crises. That often means talking to the people who have gone through some of the most traumatic events of their lives, talking to people who are helping their neighbors, who are, as the professor mentioned, stepping up and performing the work of humanitarians. It often means, of course, speaking to humanitarian workers. There are sometimes small victory stories. We and others will often publish a story, and we will get inquiries from readers asking, how can I help? What can I do? Where can I send money? I think one of the greatest things that we can do, our greatest impact, which really you can't measure, is to spread the word, is to spread awareness, and to, when our readers say, what can we do? I say, you can share this story on your social networks, share this story with everyone you know. Make sure that these crises are visible.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Kınık, you have, I think, touched on an important issue when it comes to international cooperation in the face of large crises. The Middle East, Africa, and some other places, there are lots of crises and many actors are involved in it. And also, as you have said, there is a rise of nativism and populism. The countries are competing with each other. In such an environment, how do you think we can break the cycle of these obstacles? Because I think civil society organizations and international organizations need cooperation. Otherwise, individual countries sometimes cannot really overcome the crisis and challenges.
We must. But I agree with Professor Kapila that we have to restructure our logic and frame and our terms and our concepts in terms of defining crisis or habit of crisis or root cause of the problems. Because if we start with the wrong clarification or definition, we will reach the wrong destination. For example, we are defining LDCs, like least developed countries. If we look at the root causes of that least developed countries, is, we can say, most exploiting countries. So it is totally different description, but we have to touch upon the root causes. Yes, there is unfair sharing. There is totalitarian the regimes putting pressure upon their own societies, and a lot of the problems we are facing. But if we keep us silent and don't touch this kind of problems, like our President Erdogan always saying, touching this painful points, because we have to diagnose the root causes. We as physicians, examining the patient with our hands and manipulation, where is the pain? So the solidarity we need. Why? Because all the problems that we are talking on are the global problems, issues. So the solutions of the global problems must be unique, and we have to spend our effort jointly, reducing the cost, having the efficiency and effectiveness. We need solidarity. But if we look at the UN system, in 2005, the humanitarian system totally changed, reformed by the UN. What we have now, we have the cluster systems, we have the appeal systems, but all this funding, I have to say that crisis-driven funding, not it is not I mean advanced funding system, financing system to humanitarian actors. In World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul 2016, it is we have resolution that the localization in the grand bargain item, and we set up a certain key performance indicator for the localization. And after 4 years, in 2016, 2% of total resources were going to the local actors. Now, almost 3.5. Where is the 25%? So the smalls are always small, and the bingos are always big. We have to change and restructure all this ecosystem.
Well, thank you very much. I think that criticism is also leveled against the world order, as you know. There's a lot of, I think, discussion on international organizations and the balance of power in the world. I just would like to hear from Mukesh Kapila about his, let's say, vision for the future as far as the changes are concerned. Yes, there is a need for change, but what should be the new paradigm?
Well, I think we need to totally revisit the relationship between the local, the national, and the global. Now, the global institutions that are very familiar to us, the UN and others, many of them are around 70 years old. They were born in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I think overall they've done a great job over the last few decades. The problem is that the world has changed faster than these organizations have changed. The problem also is that the incentives have changed completely, in that the business model of the multilateral organizations, which was developed at a time when the world was less connected, when the world was less well endowed, when the world was less technologically competent, when the world had fewer people who were less self-aware. And today, all of that situation has changed. We live at a moment in history where everywhere in the world, in the poorest countries, most vulnerable countries, you will find the most articulate people, the most intelligent people, and also, even though there are high levels of illiteracy still, illiterate people doesn't mean they're uneducated people. So we have, if you like, a turbulent and an effervescent world which we live in. And yet our multilateral global institutions, where incidentally I've spent a lot of my life and where I have made a very nice career, thank you very much. So, I should declare that right at the very beginning. But the problem is there are no incentives to change there in a way. So today we have a competition going on between the global sphere and the national sphere. And within the national sphere, there's a competition between the national sphere and the local sphere. So since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, and it was great to be present in Istanbul at that time, many promises were made, and they've certainly not been put into practice. And why should they be? The other thing I should say on the geopolitics of humanitarian work, or geopolitics generally of the world, is to say that we have to turn this paradigm of where multilateral cooperation depends on subjugating nations down and asking them to somehow surrender some of their kind of natural dignity and their natural pride into some kind of amorphous whole called the UN or the European Union or any regional body you can think of. I think those days are gone. And in the same way that you cannot build a strong house without every part of the house being strong, and some parts need to be stronger than the other parts, for example, the foundations. Similarly, you cannot build multilateral cooperation effectively on the foundations of weak nation states. So there's critics out there who are saying that we are living in a world of huge creeping nationalism, that we have a strong man emerging in different countries, and the world is being driven apart by strong authoritarian countries, trying to kind of muscle in and dominate, if you like to see. Now, historically, we will come to see this phase as a natural phase of countries trying to assert themselves in a world where everyone wants to be seen as equal. And multilateralism, and to answer your questions, global cooperation that is based on willing cooperation among strong states is the answer for the future, not an international system that is a hegemony of the rich, hegemony of the big, is a hegemony of a geopolitical powers, West, East, North, South, and the smaller countries are supposed to come along with that and say that this is part of the price to pay for so-called international cooperation. I don't believe in international cooperation if it is founded on a system which actually creates inequality amongst nations and reduces the dignity of sovereign people everywhere in the world. So I think the way I see answering the question is, let us have more disruption. Let us actually recognize that the current international cooperation system has led us to a place where we have record levels of misery, whether it is failure in achieving certain targets of development, whether it's in record levels of vulnerability and risk, and we've led to a stage where not only the people are sick, but the planet is also sick. Now, what kind of international cooperation are we talking about? And definitely improving the current system is certainly one approach, but I don't believe that doing more of the same thing is necessarily going to give us a different answer. So I want to challenge the system, not encourage it to work more of as it is now.
Professor Kapila, thank you. I think there is a lot of need to work for the deconstruction. You said disruption, and I call it deconstruction of the world system or whatever we have, the hegemony, as you have just mentioned.
I don't want to destroy. I think we need to look at who are the winners and the losers of the current system. And I think are the winners willing to give way or not? And I see no sign of that.
I perfectly understand you, actually. We are on the same camp anyway, as far as the need for change is concerned. But I think both of you, Mr. Kapila and Mr. Kınık, you call for innovation in terms of humanitarian aid. Then I think the art, cinema, journalism, these sort of areas maybe might bring some insight as far as how we can deal with the new challenges. Now, I would like to come to Ghada Saba. In the first question, I asked you about the gender equality, but now I just would like to go into more specific area, that is violence against women. This is also some kind of humanitarian issue, especially in some countries, in some cultures, in some areas. This is a huge issue, and sometimes domestic violence against women. What is your view on this issue? And do you think that is culture specific, or it is beyond that? It is a class issue? It is something to do with religion? And how do you think your work can make a difference? Can you turn on your microphone, please? Turn on your microphone. We cannot hear you.
Yeah, now you can hear me. Thank you so much. Well, actually, one thing I would like to highlight before I start talking about violence against women or against gender, we have to say it's against gender now. That I agree that now if we don't give the power for the people to say what they want and to do what they can for their society as small CBOs or NGOs, we're not going to survive this crisis. I believe that now the people inside every country and every region should be the people who are taking control of how they are thinking and how they are they can vision tomorrow. And I think the only thing that's going to happen after this crisis, after COVID-19, is changing the way we look at the global, where we look about ourselves, the way I look about films, the festivals, how I want to be heard. Our problem, back to your question, our problem in women against violence against women or violence against gender in general, it's so many things. It's not only one thing. I think it's a mindset that we've been working on to change the mindset of people of thinking of women. We have, when we say violence against women, we say violence against women in every aspect. There's very high percentage of women all over the world that are still facing all kinds of violence when it comes to their like economy violence or political violence. Now also in our TV shows and films, when we want to highlight I'm talking about the Arab world, okay? When we want to talk about women in politics, for example, she cannot succeed in politics unless she comes from a family that her husband is big in politics, so he makes the way to her, or because they, you know what I mean? So it's not because she deserved to be in politics. And this is not true, because we have so many women who are in our parliament and are in our government. They made it because they deserve to be there, because it's equality. They deserve it. They're not thinking of themselves as men or women. They're thinking of themselves as good people at what they do, as doctors, as politicians, whatever. So I think violence against women in the Arab world, in the world, we are still in the very small steps towards towards the end of it. But I think also we have to work hand in hand with men against it, because this is what I always say when it comes to my work. Regarding my work as my non-profit organization, that we try to focus on gender equality and violence against women and early marriage, we have to work with men. Until this minute, we are working more with women, which we have to raise the awareness, of course, of women, of the right. But parallel to this, we have to know that the man in our country and in our world, okay, Arab world, is still the decision maker. If we don't change the mindset of the man and bring him back to what he used to be, because our men, I believe our men used to respect women more, used to know that they have to be equal in this world to survive. So I think we need to work hand in hand with men to reach gender equality and to reach the end of violence against women, especially in this time.
Well, thank you. Now, coming back to, again, humanitarian journalism, Josephine. So what are the main challenges that the journalists in the office, in the field, are facing when it comes to reporting humanitarian issues? Because when we talk about humanitarian crisis, we are not talking about, comfortable places and comfortable area. I think this is one challenge, but I think there are some other challenges as well, because when you look at the coverage of the humanitarian issues, there is no commercial value. Maybe there is, conflict of interests. So how do you see the challenges, and what we can do to overcome such challenges that are faced by journalists as far as humanitarian reporting is concerned?
Sure, thanks for the question. In terms of getting the story, doing the reporting, many of the challenges we face are similar to those that humanitarians who are in the field are facing. I mean, we are one of the few media outlets that do on-the-ground reporting day in, day out. We look at our work as being able to really ground truth, much of what is behind the dire predictions, the multi-page reports that come out, etc. Often simply to get into these places, it's very, very difficult because of geographic location, because of conflict, etc. We will at times work with humanitarian organizations to gain access, much as during conflicts, reporters will often embed with military. We personally at PNH do not embed with humanitarian organizations. And when we do travel on a convoy or on a flight that is a UN flight or a transport by another organization, we're very clear with our readers in saying that we're doing that because we want our work to be perceived as absolutely independent and unbiased. So the general logistics are a problem. Transparency of information is always a problem. There are often, humanitarian crises are very political. Humanitarian work is by fact very political. And there are a number of people who want to control the narrative. So getting access and getting truth, in quotes, from politicians, from governments can be very, very difficult. We try to work very closely with journalists on the ground, with local journalists who we find have much better connections than what is often the typical mainstream media model of parachuting in a journalist from some large capital and having him or her be there for 3 or 4 days and then leave. So that's one way that we're able to be sure that we have accurate information. And another is simply boots on the ground. It's simply being there. It's simply having the tenacity to talk to people. It's simply, and perhaps not so simple, allowing the people who are at the center of these crises to tell their stories in their words. There's one thing I would like to mention. We've spoken so much about swapping the narrative and the need to change perception and the need to really turn our heads around about how we work. I think as good humanitarian journalists, we are doing that as well. And I think for such a long time, as you point out, humanitarian news has been dire, dark, awful news because we report on the dire, dark, awful situations and the horrible things that humans do to each other. And you're exactly right. There is very little commercial value in this. There are very few clicks that come through on this, and that's the business model of media these days. So we need to find the heart of this, not only the head, but we have to appeal to people's hearts when we're reporting. And by doing that, and to do that, I think it's incumbent upon us to swap the narrative around, to really move from looking at people in the midst of these crises as victims to people who can take action and want to take action and are looking for a way to take action to change their situation. It's incumbent on us to look very closely at the language we use. You know, in the humanitarian world, people who receive aid are referred to too often as beneficiaries. Well, that puts them in a pretty powerless situation. So is there another way to look at who they are and to describe who they are? And even when we're looking at telling the story, is there a way to go from looking at the dire to just looking at what's truly remarkable about this? For instance, we recently had a story of a Venezuelan woman who had migrated to Colombia, and her livelihood had been severely impacted by COVID-19 lockdowns. To the point where she was worried about keeping a roof over her head, feeding her kids, etc. She made food and sold it on the street. She was no longer able to do that. What she was doing was making ice at home and selling ice. To me, that is a really incredible, miraculous thing. So instead of introducing her as someone who had been pushed down by the pandemic, who was no longer able to feed her kids, let's present her as someone who is trying her darndest to do that. And this is how she's doing it.
Well, I think that's a great story, of course, to see. And I think that is encouraging. That is also very optimistic. Now, I just would like to turn to Dr. Kınık, who is leading one of the largest, I think, humanitarian organizations, that is Turkish Red Crescent. Turkish Red Crescent, as far as I know, has been active in many countries, more than 100 countries, I guess. But this, COVID-19, I think, put a lot of pressure on such organizations. I just wonder what sort of, challenges you faced, whether you had to change some of your activities or plans or, structures. Can you please tell us your experience? Because your experience also is experience of many other such large-scale organizations in this area. Your microphone is not on, Mr. Kınık. Can you turn your microphone on, please? Thank you.
Excuse me. First challenges that we are facing is complex crises. Natural, man-made, plus the biological disasters, poverty. So it is really hard to cope this kind of complex crisis. And we are witnessing everywhere actually. Many sub-Saharan African countries, South Sudan, or in Yemen or in Afghanistan. But the overall diagnosis is for coping this complex crisis, we need well-structured, well-organized system, integrated system, and community-based system. Not expert-based, not headquarter-based system. It's community-based system we have to establish. So we have to shift the paradigm because if you as an individual are ready to, any kind of crisis, if you are able to anticipate your personal risks or the regional or the national risks by your individual capacity or by your society capacities. So it is really easy to overcome. But the system is, for example, the personal protection equipment. We could send more than 100 countries in collaboration with the Minister of Health of Turkey and the Presidency of the Turkey. But we have to question, we have to ask ourselves, why these countries, suffering lack of this kind of very simple, basic, the equipments, personal protective equipments, or the hospital, the diagnostic capacity, or other healthcare structure. So if we look the America as a continent, there are almost 2 million physicians. In Europe, 3 million physicians. In all Africa as a continent, 150,000 physicians. Huge imbalance. So all these communities depend on the foreign support, foreign humanitarian aid, and it is not fair. And for example, in South Sudan, there are many crises: drought and famine crisis, food insecurity crisis, armed conflicts, and the South Sudan is a landlocked country. It's hard to reach to there, and World Food Program have large scale, humanitarian operational program, almost $1 billion US, the budget program they have for food support. But it is not, it's not suitable for them, because if we invest a railway from the Port Sudan to Juba, the one time, it's 70%, 80% of 1 billion goes to logistical cost. So if we spend 1 year cost to establish a railway to Juba, it is logical. Why? Because there are 3 main streams for responding this kind of crisis. Security-based approach. UN Security Council, for example, closed all the Turkish, the Syrian borders except one for cross-border activities. It is security, oriented approach, and they are limiting our access to the needy people. The other is, development-based approach. It is a kind of post-colonial, dirty, the term. So how we will invest the local, the capacity, local manpower, local, resilience capacity. So if we will not able to change this paradigm, we will face the biggest the problem that the governments are not willing to contribute to humanitarian agencies. Individuals asking fashionable, crisis, not neglected like Yemen or others, Syrians. So we have to invest the local capacity. But the Turkish Red Crescent, we shift our humanitarian aid from in-kind to cash, cash to social impact investment. So we were saying that we have to teach people how to catch fish, but we have to now ask ourselves how to catch fish. So we are living in a global market, economical market. So we have to keep their economical productivities and the capacities, and we have to invest their livelihood and self-sufficient livelihood system.
Dr. Kınık, you reminded me of the great amount of literature on how aid money is really spent in many areas. This Eurocentric and Western-centric approach has been really criticized in the literature, and I think you have added one more dimension to it. Now, Professor Kapila, you have written a lot of, articles on such issues, but I just want to ask you, two organizations and their performance as far as COVID and post-COVID issues are concerned, United Nations and WTO. How do you assess their performance during the crisis that we have been going through? Because you call for reforms, but I think you have some general assessment of their failures and achievements, success, etc.
Before I come to that very easy question that you've just asked me, can I just quickly comment on the journalistic point as well? Just one thing.
Sure.
And that is, I think, really reacting to Josephine and rather stimulated and inspired by Josephine. I think, I'm a great admirer of a modern humanitarian journalism. And believe me, it's come a long way since the early days. As a donor many years ago, I used to support the precursor to the New Humanitarian. In fact, I had to find it, but it was called IRA News. Now we have the New Humanitarian, which is very good. Now, unfortunately, and this is not criticism against any particular journal or particular outlet, it's a general comment. What has happened now is that we have too much of a good thing. So in the old days, I was quite content to read one newspaper and watch one TV channel, and I would get everything I needed to know. Today, and I kid you not, every evening I flick through 5 TV channels on the main evening news, and that includes TRT, by the way, and to try and get perspectives which are not covered by even BBC or Al Jazeera, etc., etc. And they're all good channels. Similarly, in the old days, I would read one newspaper, and that would be it. Today, in the morning with my breakfast, I have to read 5 newspapers in order to feel that I can face the world without having been completely dragged to one side. And I would really ask journalists, Josephine and her friends, to distinguish between reporting and analysis. We need both. So in regard to the Beirut explosion, and Beirut is a city I visited many times and I love dearly, I want to know, who was affected, how they were affected, how bad it is, how many hospitals are functioning, not functioning, etc., etc. Facts, figures. And then, of course, there is all that commentary about who's to blame, who's not to blame, whether this means change in Lebanese world, etc. All very important, and all journalists are good for. But I would like to counsel a distinguishing between facts and analysis, because otherwise facts then feed into what might turn out to be fiction, and misinformation is one of our greatest problems in the humanitarian arena as it is elsewhere. Now, that's a separate
issue. Josephine, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I would love to respond to that. Thank you for raising these issues. That's also a pet peeve of mine, this mishmash soup of opinion, fact, semi-fact, complete false news, all served up there to people who are absolutely bewildered at what they're getting. I think there's a great lack of media literacy in the world today, and that has nothing to do with how smart you are or who you are. It has to do with, do you know how to distinguish what you're reading as to whether it's fact-based, as to whether it's opinion, as to whether it's commentary. I think it's very difficult for people to do that these days. I think the insertion of the I in reporting in some ways has been a wonderful thing, because it can bring the reader much closer to the events. In other ways, it has been a very detrimental thing, because it has moved very far away from the sense that there is a time and a place for journalism that is purely factual and straight ahead and does not need someone's opinion to color it. So I absolutely agree with you on that. I would say that, especially in this time of COVID-19, we, as journalists at the New Humanitarian, have been very grateful to be able to tap the voices of many people on the ground in places where we simply can't travel right now. And in some cases, we speak to people and ask them to report for us, to find information for us. In other cases, we simply ask them to tell us in a first-person account, what are you seeing? What are you feeling? Which I think is valid in its own way. But when we do that, we're always very careful to clearly mark that as opinion, as a first-person narrative, and then also to have links to factual articles about the situation. And I agree with you that misinformation is certainly one of the many enemies of humanitarian work. And I'll just add one more thing, which is that we have been hearing more and more from local audiences who will read our work now, especially in this time of COVID, people in the countries from which we report. And what we hear most often is we can't find media in our own country that we trust. And so I think the value of trusted, verified, fact-based journalism it has gone sky high, if only people knew where to find it. But you can find it at the Humanitarian.
Thank you. My concluding question goes to Ghada Saba, because UN and WTO issue are very simple for Professor Kapila. He said that it was obvious anyway. So my last question is to you, Ghada. It's about, again, gender issue, women issue. You said men and women should cooperate in resolving some of the issues, like early marriage, for example. You have to change the mindset of people. But you also encourage women to take part in politics, in civil society organizations, etc. This is a meaningful, I think, effort. Do you think, at least in your environment, in your country, in your, let's say, cultural milieu, women face challenges in terms of helping vulnerable people? Because women are supposed to be at the backyard, usually. This is the mentality. What sort of specific challenges that they encounter in helping the others? And how do you overcome these sort of issues anyway?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the challenges are similar kind of all over the world, especially nowadays. Well, I have to say during COVID-19 and during this crisis, I think the women, especially the women in front lines, had to find the time to do their work, and also to be for their kids, because we had all the education online. I think just the challenge today for women and men and on gender is the same, to make time and to try to help, not only because you work on front line as media or in medical or as a volunteer or whatever, but I think we are all in the same boat today, and we are all together in that, as they say. And if we don't face our daily challenges of making a decent living for our family, as in education and health and providing everything, we're not going to be in the place that we deserve to be at the end. So the challenges in Jordan, I have to say, for women today, that they have to keep their kids educated, and they have to keep them on, they had to keep them going on with their education online, and that was a challenge for the whole country, not only for the parents. Two, I have to say that so many now are frustrated because it's either they can't pursue with their dreams because they're out of jobs, or because they don't have enough income for their houses. And the women, of course, is part of this, because we know most of especially middle and average, people, the women always work in the house. So the challenges today for women in Jordan and for gender in general, just to literally keep a decent mind, thinking of tomorrow as an opportunity, not as a crisis, and as something that so many things are going to be changed, nothing going to be the same. This is what I believe, yani, from my humble point of view. So the challenge today is that tomorrow going to be a completely different world, and we have to cope with it. And it's about us. It's not about what the global want. It's about what we want as people, what we want as women, what we
these are very
deserve
clear
as
messages
nation.
that we have heard from you. Now, it's been more than an hour. I wish we had more time with such an excellent panelists. I would like to thank all of you. We come to the end of our TRT World Forum Digital Debates, the session dedicated on the humanitarian work in an age of constant crisis. Professor Kapila, Josephine Smith, Kerem Kınık, Ghada Saba, thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to call on our viewers to spread the message to all around the world and to be with us next time. Thank you, and all the best to you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.